Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle a question that I find both unsettling and crucial.
Mhm.
Could we have maybe prevented 9/11 by really understanding Osama bin Laden's psychology?
That's a tough one. A question that intelligence agencies, and policymakers have been wrestling with for years.
And to really unpack this, we're going to dive deep into this report, Killing in the Name of God, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And it was written by, well, Dr. Gerald M. Post. He is a leading expert in this field of political psychology.
You're not kidding. Dr. Post's background is impressive. Professor of psychiatry, political psychology, and international affairs. Director of the political psychology program at the George Washington University. He even founded the Center for the Analysis of Personality and Political Behavior.
Wow, talk about credentials.
Ooh.
So we're definitely in good hands as we sort of explore how someone becomes a terrorist mastermind. And one of the first things that really jumped out at me from this report was just how different bin Laden's early life was from what most people might imagine.
Totally. I mean, the image a lot of people have of bin Laden is this guy emerging from poverty and despair. But honestly, he was born into immense privilege. His dad was a multi-billionaire construction magnate in Saudi Arabia.
It's crazy, right? Can you imagine inheriting $57 million when you're just 16? I mean, for most of us, that's like winning the lottery a bunch of times over.
It's mind-boggling. And it probably gave him a sense of entitlement for sure. But Dr. Post suggests it might have actually fueled a different kind of alienation. Like maybe it even made him an outsider, even within his own wealthy family.
Hmm. Interesting. Outsider in a family of insiders.
Right. And his mom, Hamida, was reportedly one of his father's less favored wives.
Yeah.
There's even some speculation that bin Laden was actually taunted, called the son of the slave.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you can imagine the psychological impact of that kind of family dynamic,
Yes.
especially in a culture where family and lineage are so important.
Right, right. So it's almost like a twisted origin story. The privileged son who finds purpose by rejecting his privilege, and even embracing a life of hardship and struggle.
Yeah. And that's the paradox Dr. Post dives into in his report. And get this, bin Laden was also a highly educated man, trained in civil engineering and business management.
Really?
Yeah. Skills that honestly could have led him to a very successful and, well, conventional career.
Instead, he chooses to become the leader of a global terrorist organization. And something else that fascinated me was the role that Abdullah Azzam, he was a radical Palestinian professor at King Abdulaziz University, played in bin Laden's whole transformation.
Azzam was like a mentor to bin Laden, shaping his views on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. He saw it as like this holy war, a jihad against the enemies of Islam, and he really instilled that worldview in bin Laden.
And then bin Laden, with all his organizational skills and access to, well, a ton of money, jumps in headfirst. He helps Azzam create that MAK network, which was responsible for funneling thousands of foreign fighters into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets.
And this is where bin Laden really transforms. He goes from being this wealthy, somewhat idealistic young man to a battle-hardened leader, fighting alongside his recruits. You just wonder, what kind of impact did that experience have? They actually succeeded in driving out a superpower.
Wow. Yeah. It makes you think, did that victory convince bin Laden that he was, chosen? Like he was destined to lead a global jihad?
That's the key question Dr. Post tries to answer. He argues that the defeat of the Soviets, despite the odds, became proof to bin Laden and his followers that God was on their side. And that fueled this really dangerous sense of destiny and righteousness.
But then the Cold War ends. The Soviets pull out of Afghanistan. You'd think that would be the end of it. But bin Laden's vision starts to shift.
Yeah. It's almost like instead of going home a hero, he picks a new enemy. An even bigger one, the United States.
That's a crazy twist. What could have possibly caused that kind of shift?
Well, Dr. Post points to a few things. First, there was this ideological rift between bin Laden and his mentor, Azzam. Azzam was more interested in building an Islamic state within Afghanistan. And then, in 1989, Azzam is killed in a car bombing. Still a mystery to this day.
Wow. Talk about convenient timing.
Right. People have always suspected the Pakistani intelligence service, but it was never definitively proven. Either way, Azzam's death left a void. And guess who steps right in?
Bin Laden, of course.
Exactly. It's like the stage was set for him. And then, boom, the Gulf War happens. U.S. troops stationed on Saudi soil in the land of the two holy mosques.
And that just set him off.
Completely. Bin Laden saw it as a total betrayal, a desecration of Islam's most sacred sites.
Right.
He starts publicly denouncing the Saudi government, the U.S., Israel, everyone.
So now his personal grudge against the Saudi royal family gets all mixed up with this broader ideological fight against the West.
Exactly. and bin Laden's criticisms, they get a little too loud for the Saudis. He ends up exiled, they revoke his citizenship, even his own family cuts ties with him.
Talk about a turning.
It was. He's rejected by his homeland, by his family, and it fuels his rage, his sense of being wronged.
And all that anger, all that frustration, he channels it into building a new kind of terrorist organization, one that would shock the world with its ambition and ruthlessness.
And this is where Dr. Post's analysis gets really interesting. He argues that Al Qaeda wasn't just a group of fanatics. They were structured like a corporation, with bin Laden as the chairman of the board.
A corporation of terror. That's a pretty frightening thought. So if bin Laden was the chairman who was running the day-to-day operations?
That would be Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was a key figure in the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and also bin Laden's designated successor. He was basically the CEO of this whole terrorist enterprise.
So we have this terrorist corporation, with the CEO even, a whole hierarchy. But how did they actually function?
Well, just like any well-run organization, they had specialized departments, like committees. Each had its own specific responsibilities.
Okay, so like what were these committees exactly?
Well, Dr. Post, he identifies 5 main ones: the military, business, communications, Islamic studies, and media committees. And each one played, a crucial role in how Al Qaeda operated and how they were able to reach, like, a global audience.
Let's start with the business committee, I guess, because you need a lot of money to run a global terror network. Where did all that funding come from?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Terrorism is unfortunately expensive. Dr. Post estimates that Al Qaeda had a budget of around $50 million every year.
50 million, wow.
And some of it came from, wealthy donors, people who were sympathetic to their cause. They often funneled money through Islamic charities.
So they weren't just relying on, like, small donations?
Oh, no, not at all. They were really good at using both legitimate and, clandestine sources of income. They also had connections to criminal networks, the kind involved in drug trafficking, smuggling, all sorts of illicit activities.
So it was almost like a dark mirror of legitimate business. They were using the same tools and strategies, but for a terrifyingly different purpose.
Yeah, that's what makes them so dangerous. They're not just a bunch of fanatics hiding in caves. They were a sophisticated, well-funded enterprise with a global reach.
And they even had this whole committee dedicated to, like, justifying their actions through religion, the Islamic Studies Committee.
Yes. This is where they really manipulate religious texts. This committee's job was to issue fatwas. They're like religious rulings. And these fatwas declared that attacks against the West were, like, divinely sanctioned.
So basically, they were twisting Islamic teachings to fit their violent agenda.
Exactly. They were taking verses from the Quran out of context,
Yeah.
To try to make their actions seem legitimate, and also to appeal to young Muslims who might be looking for a sense of purpose or belonging.
So speaking of carrying out these attacks, that brings us to the military committee, the muscle of the organization, right? These are the guys planning the attacks.
Right. They were responsible for recruitment, training, and deploying operatives all over the world. And their track record is, well, chillingly effective.
Yeah. I mean, the bombings of the Khobar Towers, the first World Trade Center attack in '93, the U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, the attack on the USS Cole, all of those have Al Qaeda's fingerprints on them.
And those attacks, as horrible as they were just a preview of what was to come with 9/11.
Reading this report, you really get a sense of the planning, the meticulous preparation that went into those attacks. It's hard not to, like, shudder thinking about the cold, calculated way they went about it.
Yeah. And Dr. Post actually gives us a glimpse into their mindset by analyzing Al Qaeda's training manual. It goes way beyond just, like, teaching basic weapons handling and bomb making. It's almost like a guide to living a double life, keeping secrets, and justifying violence through this twisted interpretation of Islam.
Wow. So it was more about indoctrination than just tactical training.
Exactly. The manual aims to turn recruits into, true believers who are willing to die for their cause. And some of the instructions are really disturbing. For example, they were told to blend into Western societies. Like, they had to shave their beards, avoid wearing traditional Islamic clothing, and even temporarily abandon any outward signs of their faith.
So they were being trained to basically be chameleons, hiding in plain sight until they were ready to attack. That's so devious.
And incredibly effective. It helps explain how the 9/11 hijackers were able to live in the U.S. for years without being detected.
That's a scary thought.
It is. And one of the most disturbing parts of the manual is the section on hostages.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading that.
It's pretty rough.
Yeah.
It basically gives instructions on how to beat, torture, even kill hostages. And they use stories from the life of the prophet to justify these actions.
But isn't that a complete distortion of what Islam actually teaches?
Absolutely. They're twisting these stories and completely ignoring the Quran's emphasis on mercy and compassion. They're creating a narrative that serves their own violent agenda.
It's a reminder that Al Qaeda isn't bound by conventional morality, or even their own stated religious beliefs. They're willing to justify any act, no matter how horrific, as long as it serves their cause.
You're right. And that's why understanding their ideology, their worldview, is so important. You can't counter something you don't understand.
So we've talked about leadership, committees, ideology, but how did this global network actually function, like on a practical level?
Well, Al Qaeda had a presence in something like 76 countries around the world. They weren't just operating out of Afghanistan. They had cells everywhere, and they often functioned independently. Very little direct control from the top leadership.
So it was less like a traditional army and more like, I don't know, a franchise with independent branches using the same brand name?
That's a good analogy. And that decentralized structure made them very difficult to fight.
Yeah.
You could take out one cell or even capture or kill a key leader, but the network itself would remain intact.
And I read that they weren't afraid to partner with other terrorist organizations, even those with completely different ideologies.
You're right. They were very pragmatic in that sense. They saw anyone who opposed the West as a potential ally. So they worked with groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, even the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. It was all about furthering that goal of global jihad. It didn't matter if they had religious or ideological differences.
So it wasn't just religious fanaticism, it was also about political strategy. They were willing to work with anyone, even their enemies, as long as it helped them advance their cause.
Exactly, and that made them even more dangerous and unpredictable.
Speaking of unpredictable, what about the future of Al Qaeda? After 9/11, there was that huge global response. The U.S. launched the war on terror, going after Al Qaeda and their Taliban allies in Afghanistan. Did those initial military operations cripple them?
Well, they definitely disrupted their operations, destroyed a lot of their infrastructure, killed or captured a lot of key leaders. But remember that decentralized structure we talked about?
Yeah,
Well, it also made them incredibly resilient.
like a hydra. Cut off one head and two more grow back.
Exactly. Plus, they had a system of designated successors. So even if they lost a key leader, someone else was ready to take over immediately.
So they were built to handle losses, operate in the shadows, and adapt to any changes.
That's right. And that's one of the scariest things about them. They're not just reacting to events. They're thinking long-term, planning for anything, and constantly adjusting their strategies.
And even though we haven't seen another 9/11 scale attack since the war on terror started, it doesn't mean they're gone.
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, that lack of a major attack could actually mean that they're biding their time, regrouping, and planning something even worse. Don't forget, they can spend years meticulously planning a single operation.
Which brings us to the big question. What's next for Al Qaeda? Dr. Post, he lays out several possibilities, and he really focuses on the potential impact of, leadership losses. So let's start with the most dramatic one. What happens if Osama bin Laden is killed or captured?
Well, it would definitely be a huge symbolic and operational blow to the organization. But I think Dr. Post believes they would probably survive. Remember, Ayman al-Zawahiri was basically running things day to day already.
So it would be a pretty smooth transition of power.
Probably.
Yeah.
Zawahiri was a respected figure within al-Qaeda, and he definitely had the experience and charisma to hold the organization together. But of course, there's always the risk that bin Laden's death could turn him into a martyr, like a symbol of resistance. And that could actually inspire more violence.
It's like this double-edged sword. You get rid of the leader, but you might create a powerful new symbol for the movement.
Exactly. And Dr. Post acknowledges that. He also thinks about what would happen if Zawahiri was killed or captured, but bin Laden was still around.
Okay, so in that scenario, bin Laden is still alive. He's still in charge. But his right-hand man is gone. How would that affect Al Qaeda?
It probably wouldn't be as smooth a transition. But I think Dr. Post still believes that Al Qaeda would find a way to adapt and recover. They have a lot of potential leaders, and their ideology, that belief in fighting a holy war against the enemies of Islam, is a powerful motivator.
So even if you take out the top two leaders, you haven't really eliminated the ideology that drives the movement.
You got it. And that's what makes it so challenging. You're not just fighting an organization. You're fighting an idea, a worldview. And it's taken root in the minds of individuals and groups all over the world.
And then there's that last, almost mythical scenario that Dr. Post brings up. What if bin Laden just disappears? No capture, no body, no confirmation of death. He's just gone.
That's a really interesting thought.
Right.
Imagine all the rumors and speculation and conspiracy theories. He could become a legend, a ghost, a symbol of defiance that could inspire even more fanaticism.
It's like, the Elvis thing, but with a much darker side.
Right. And that's the problem with dealing with a movement that's fueled by religious fervor. It doesn't necessarily follow the same rules of logic and reason as traditional political movements.
So it sounds like no matter what happens to the leadership, the threat of Al Qaeda-inspired terrorism is going to be with us for a while.
I think that's a safe bet.
Yeah.
And it just highlights how important it is to have a multifaceted approach to counterterrorism. We can't rely on military force alone. We need to address the conditions that lead to extremism in the first place.
So we need to challenge their ideology, that twisted version of Islam that justifies violence and hate. We have to offer a better vision, one that focuses on peace, tolerance, and understanding.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the political and economic grievances that make people angry and resentful toward the West.
Right. But didn't Dr. Post also say that even the way we frame the conflict can backfire?
Yeah. He thinks that calling it the war on terror might actually be helping Al Qaeda. Yeah. It's a controversial idea, but it's worth thinking about. Dr. Post argues that by calling it a war on terror, we risk alienating a lot of Muslims who we need on our side.
Because it makes it seem like the West is at war with Islam itself.
That's the idea. And that plays right into Al Qaeda's hands. They want to be seen as the defenders of Islam, like they're warriors fighting against a crusader invasion.
So by using that language, the language of war, and by focusing only on military solutions, are we basically helping them recruit more followers and making it harder to separate them from the rest of the Muslim community?
It's a real risk. Dr. Post suggests we need a more balanced approach. We need a battle of ideas alongside the battle against terrorism.
So we can't just defeat Al Qaeda militarily, we have to defeat their ideology as well.
Right. We have to offer a convincing alternative to their message of hate and violence. And that means understanding what causes extremism in the first place, like the historical grievances, the political frustrations, the economic inequalities. All those things create an environment where radicalization can flourish.
So it's a long and complicated process.
It is, but it's a process we can't ignore. The stakes are too high. Global security depends on how effectively we can counter Al Qaeda's ideology and prevent it from spreading even further.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. We went from like bin Laden's super privileged upbringing to Al Qaeda's, intricate structure, their disturbing training manual, and even all those different scenarios for the future of the organization. It's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's important to remember that we can talk about all this, analyze Al Qaeda's motivations and methods, and even dissect their really warped interpretations of religious texts without endorsing or condoning their actions at all.
Right, exactly. Like this deep dive isn't about justifying anything. Remember, we started by asking, could understanding bin Laden's psychology have maybe helped prevent 9/11? And I think by exploring Dr. Post's report, we're getting a little closer to some answers.
I think so too. But Dr. Post doesn't really offer any easy solutions. The challenge of combating terrorism is so complex. It requires, I think, a comprehensive and nuanced response.
One of the things that really stood out to me was how resilient Al Qaeda is because of that, decentralized network. Even if you somehow manage to eliminate the top leadership, the ideology itself can still spread.
That's a key takeaway for sure. We're not just dealing with an organization, it's more like a movement, a global network of individuals and groups united by this ideology.
And that ideology, as Dr. Post points out, comes from this very specific and distorted interpretation of Islam. They're twisting religious texts, taking things out of context to justify their violence. It's really scary.
It's a classic example of how religion can be manipulated. Powerful symbols and narratives, twisted to serve political agendas and to incite violence.
And that manipulation can be so effective, especially when you're targeting young people who are looking for meaning and purpose, who want to belong.
Exactly. So it's crucial to actively counter that narrative. We need to present a different understanding of Islam, one that emphasizes, peace, tolerance, and compassion.
Right. But it's not just about theology, is it? We also have to think about those political and economic grievances that fuel this, like resentment and anger toward the West.
Absolutely. Addressing those root causes is crucial. We need to promote dialogue, create opportunities for people who feel marginalized or disenfranchised, try to foster real understanding.
We talked about it earlier, but even the way we talk about the conflict, framing it as a war on terror, can actually backfire.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance. We have to take the threat seriously and respond forcefully, But at the same time, we have to be careful about the language we use. Framing it as a war on terror could alienate the very people we need to win over.
Because it just reinforces that narrative of a clash of civilizations, right? Like it's the West against Islam, and that's exactly what Al Qaeda wants us to believe.
Exactly. We need a smarter, more strategic approach. It's not enough to just defeat Al Qaeda on the battlefield. We need to defeat their ideology.
So, what does all this mean for us? Like, as individuals, what can we do to help counter this threat?
Well, I think it starts with education. We need to understand how complex this issue really is. We need to challenge those narratives that promote violence and hatred, and support initiatives that are working for peace and understanding.
So, knowledge is power, but we have to do something with it. It's about becoming engaged, not just informed.
Well said. It's a long road, a challenging road, but we have to try. We can't afford to lose.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. It's definitely been a sobering but really important conversation.
I agree. And I hope it's given you a better understanding of how complicated terrorism is and why we need a multifaceted response.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and let's all work towards a better future.